10.
Right. So let me just quickly introduce our next speaker, and then I get out of your way and over to you then. Sukhmani Khorana is a Scientia Associate Professor in the School of Arts and Media at UNSW. Sukhmani has published extensively on migrant media, the politics of empathy and belonging, and self-representation for refugees. She is the author of Mediated Emotions of Migration, Reclaiming Affect for Agency, came out in 2023, The Tastes and Politics of Intercultural Food in Australia from 2018, and she has a forthcoming co-authored book. It's called Migrants, Television and Australian Stories, A New History, that's coming out in 2025. Sukhmani has an emerging interest in discourses of race and multiculturalism in the era of information disorder, and we're welcoming you, and over to you then.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Is that good? Okay, and I'll use the clicker. That's perfect. Yeah. Lecture style is perfect. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ruben, for the kind invite. And I'm very pleased to hear about the research group here. As I was just saying, it's always interesting to find pockets where there's intersections of justice work with technology work. So I'd be eager to hear what else is on the reading list for the research group and on the reading group as well. I just wanted to have a longish preface, I guess, to say that in terms of my work and trajectory so far, I have one foot in migration studies, another foot in media and cultural studies. So I always refer people back to my first year text, image and culture classroom at the University of Adelaide, where I first, my lecturer first decoded Children Overboard and Tampa. And I think it's informed what I've done in terms of my research work and in terms of my advocacy work ever since. So the recent interest in misinformation and disinformation, of course, I'm assuming that everything we know about misinformation and disinformation is algorithms are fundamental to how it spreads. So I think when I first hear about misinformation, disinformation becoming a phenomenon which is of interest, it does take me back to that classroom and the Children Overboard saga and how there's a longer history to, fake images and fake news. But obviously in the era of information disorder, as it's being called now, including in the new disinformation and misinformation bill, I guess in the era of information disorder, there is obviously a proliferation of this phenomena and an amplification of this phenomena. So I'm not going to be speaking to a particular platform. So I'm going to be speaking to social phenomena, which happens to be online and which intersects with certain issues to do with race and migration in this country and also in the US. The reason I've looking at US in the second part of this talk is because as part of a project, I'm trying to map civil society organizations that are trying to combat mis and disinformation online. And it just so happens that most of this is being done in the American context by young people of color. But I'll speak to that later on in my talk. I'm really interested in starting with the story of Fatima Payman and what happened, I think it was a couple of months ago, when a coalition senator first accused Labour Senator Fatima Payman of supporting terrorists before withdrawing the claim, and the general kind of aura of misinformation and disinformation that surrounded the fact that she later resigned from the Labour Party. And there was only one kind of critical piece that really examined media coverage of the Payman saga, and that was in Crikey. So there were a number of hot takes that have been doing the rounds. The Sydney Morning Herald's Parnell Palmer Guinness suggested that the Islamic concept of ummah or community was taken out of step with notions of social cohesion, while stablemate Peter Harcher asked why Payman was the Pauline Hanson of the left in becoming a single issue politician. The Australian Financial Review's Phil Coorey, in an appearance to the ABC's Insiders, described the mere act of political groups organizing around Islam as compared to the Christian Democrats of the late 1990s as inflammatory, while the Australian's Paul Kelly said that Payman had broken the rules of multiculturalism. So I guess it's pretty obvious that these headlines are exploiting stereotypes about Islam and Islamophobia and about Muslim women in particular that have existed for a very long time, but have obviously amplified in the wake of 9/11. So I guess what I want to highlight through these headlines, including the one in News Limited, which was quite shocking to see, but also maybe not that surprising given what News Limited reports on. This one says, exiled Labour senators' donations to Barbie-hating Islamic TV studio revealed. But also there were, headlines in the ABC. There was a piece written by Patricia Carvelis, which became somewhat controversial, in which she suggested that Fatima Payman's decision expected as caucus colleagues expressed concern over claims she was guided by God. And then there was obviously a lot of commentary on Twitter and other places by Muslim advocates and people from the community saying that, people who are saying that this is controversial or this is a problem that she's being guided by God in making decisions in parliament is actually, that just shows that people don't understand how people in Muslim communities talk. But obviously that none of that was in the mainstream. So another kind of side project, which I guess is good to see there is scholarship emerging on that, is how misinformation and disinformation proliferates on mainstream media. It's not just a social media phenomena. So in response to a lot of this commentary, Fatima Payman said, "I don't know how to respond to that question without feeling offended or insulted at the suggestion that just because I'm a visibly Muslim woman, I only care about Muslim issues." She said, "This topic on Palestinian recognition, Palestinian liberation is a matter that has impacted everyone with a conscience. It is not just a Jewish versus Muslim issue." So I guess this is where I'm getting to the intersectional part of the conversation, because similar in some ways to Fatima Payman, the squad in the US, the 4 women of color women have also had a lot of disinformation being subjected at them, being thrown at them since I think about 2018. And I'm going to look at Ilhan Omar in particular, who's Somali American. Abbas Barzega, who's the director of the research and advocacy at the Council on American Islamic Relations, has said in reference to Ilhan Omar and the far-right fake news operation against her back in 2018, he said that spreading disinformation and reporting through pre-networked social media accounts and pseudo-news websites has been the preferred tactic of the Islamophobic industry for a very long time. The video of Omar dancing to pop star singer Lizzo's Truth Hurts was taken on Friday at an event celebrating Omar and 4 other congresswomen, according to Adam Green, who's the co-founder of Progressive Change Campaign Committee, who originally shared the clip to his Twitter account that evening. Omar also shared the video that day to her Twitter account. She said, "I never thought that a video taken on September 13 would be linked to September 11 and used as one more racist smear against Omar," which was the false tweet that followed this event. In the video, which was retweeted by Trump, comedian Terrence K. Williams showed the clip of Omar dancing and added, "I need to talk to Omar. Girl, what in the world were you doing celebrating on the anniversary of 9/11? So as you can probably see in the wake of the latest Trump-Harris debate and the comment that Trump made about immigrants in Springfield, Ohio, eating pets, and the fact that it was fact-checked by the moderator there and then, but it hasn't stopped the Trump Vance campaign from, kind of going on and on with that particular bit of misinformation in various kinds of media commentary, and also saying that they'll visit again, and that immigrants, obviously in that part of Ohio, but also elsewhere, are a problem. So this scapegoating of migrants is not new. We're all aware of that. I guess what I'm interested in honing in on is the phenomena that it's happening on mainstream media. Fact-checking is not helping. And what form and shape are these really long existing tropes and stereotypes taking on social media? And then secondly, the counterpoint to that is what is it that civil society movements are doing about it? I guess in terms of intersectionality, what is worth pointing out, and I'll go to the next slide. Yeah, it's working. What's worth pointing out is how in the case of people like Senator Fatima Payman and Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, their identity is being reduced to their religion, and their politics is being reduced to their religion as well. The reason I point this out is that because if you look at the political biography of Senator Payman and just the interview she did that I think it was a couple of years ago when she first became a senator, it's actually a very working class immigrant story. So her father had always encouraged her to vote Labour, not because he was very well versed in Australian politics. She's of Afghan refugee background, but because her father had a firm belief that Labour cared for the working class people. It was only once she became involved in Labour politics and as an organizer for the United Workers' Union that she realized that her father's workplace experience was one of exploitation of the kind that many migrant and low-income workers were still subjected to. So that kind of burnished her interest in entering politics, cemented by her involvement in the factional politics of WA's Labour Youth Wing, and her subsequent election as a young Labour president in 2021. So the reason I'm highlighting this is because I think it's really fascinating that in the most recent developments surrounding her kind of resignation from the Labour Party, it's the Muslim aspects of her identity and her invoking God that has been the subject of scrutiny, and not the fact that her interest in Labour Party politics was because of her father's influence and also because of her father's working class origins and her own interest in furthering those interests for other migrant families from working class backgrounds. So that part of her identity and politics is completely out of the picture in all of the mainstream media representations, obviously, and Ilhan Omar has a similar story as well, in the sense that a lot of her campaigning material, both in the upcoming election and the one before that, centers on the fact that she stands for working families. So some of you may be familiar with this literature, but I guess what I'm trying to suggest here is that there's a kind of multicultural logic of representation as opposed to an intersectional logic of representation, which is being replicated in algorithms that are sort of spreading this kind of mis and disinformation. There is a little bit of literature on what is now known as productive diversity, and there is a much longer history of scholarship on racial capitalism. But essentially what it means is that an ethnic group has growing critical mass, like in the Australian context, it could be people of particular Asian, South Asian, or Southeast Asian countries, that they have a growing critical mass and growing wealth. And hence your value to the nation, the value to the nation that you migrated to is kind of reduced to your ethnic or national affiliation. Rather than, supporting diversity or supporting refugees or supporting migrant rights on the basis of the fact that it's the right thing to do, or having a justice approach to multiculturalism, which we probably had at the time that the White Australia policy was first gotten rid of. We've moved to a kind of more productive diversity model, or a neoliberal model of multiculturalism and diversity. And I think what I'm arguing is that's what we are seeing reflected algorithmically as well. So I've got a couple of resources here if you want to check them out, which suggest that we do have to acknowledge race and not just ethnic group and not just siloed ideas of ethnic group. It's a reading by Farida Fosda, To Move Beyond It. And a second one by Stan Grant, which is referring to First Nations Australians, but I think in some ways applies to people of other racialized backgrounds in Australia as well. And it says that we are trapped in the imaginations of white Australians. So the kinds of mis and disinformation that is propagating online, in this case about Muslim politicians, but also about other groups, is obviously drawing on stereotypes that have existed for a long time, and people's ideas or the mainstream media's ideas of these women in these communities is fixed. Doesn't seem to be any kind of greater cultural understanding, despite them having been in this country for a long time now. And I'm only just started dipping into the literature on algorithms of oppression, the work by Sophia Noble, and on design justice, I guess. But that's where I'm going with this in the work on civil society movements that oppose and combat mis and disinformation. So in Noble's work, which came out in 2018 and has been quite influential since then, she talks about how, on the one hand, everyday racism and commentary on the web is an abhorrent thing in itself, and it's been detailed by lots of other scholars, but it is entirely different with a corporate platform vis-a-vis an algorithmically crafted web search that offers up racism and sexism as the first results. So I think her interest in this came because when, back in the day when she searched for Black girls, all that came up was pornography websites. So that really motivated her to try and understand why was it that technologies that is sort of thought of as neutral, coming up with search results that have nothing to do with neutrality and everything to do with racism and sexism. Although it has changed now, and she does acknowledge it in the book, but in other ways, the algorithms still have problems, and the companies, obviously, the big tech companies also have problems in terms of who's in the workforce and the kinds of agendas that they have. Another problem that's been highlighted, I think this is in work by Sasha Costanza-Chock, who's been working on design justice, but I think is applicable to many areas, including algorithms, is, and again, the use of systematically biased data sets to train algorithms using machine learning techniques is the problem. And the sort of suggestion that she's making is that the most valuable ingredient in design justice is the full inclusion of people with direct lived experience, which obviously comes from, and she acknowledges it is derived from design justice and suggestions coming from disability studies. It would have been really good to kind of listen to Jared today, but I should acknowledge that, a lot of work on lived experience and lived expertise that I draw on does come from disability justice. And design justice also encourages a shift from what is a deficit mindset that is always pointing out the vulnerabilities or the deficits in marginalized communities, which I think a lot of migration studies still tends to do, to more asset-based approaches. So working with communities to come up with solutions. And I really wanted to highlight this quote from Costanza-Chock's book. She says that design justice is a field of theory and practice that is concerned with how the design of objects and systems influence the distribution of risks, harms, benefits. And it focuses on the way the design is reproduced by, or challenges the matrix of domination, white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, capitalism, and settler colonialism. It's also a growing social movement that aims to ensure a more equitable distribution of design's benefits and burdens, fair and meaningful participation in design decisions, and recognition of community-based traditions, knowledges, and practices. So I guess the conversation has moved a little bit from the work that Sophia Noble's done on algorithms of oppression, making changes within tech companies, to actually just looking at design paradigms as a whole and working with the concept of design justice. So I guess I'm using that as a segue to move on to the second part of the talk, which is about civil society movements, particularly in the US, that are trying to counter online mis and disinformation, which is centered on race. And I would have loved to do this work in Australia, but we don't have that kind of centering of race. There's a little bit of work coming out of QUT that looks at the results of the voice referendum and the mis and disinformation, the propaganda, the mainstream media and social media in relation to it. But that's still big data. We don't have a kind of, how is it that either certain migrant communities were, can be extrapolated from the data is not clear, but also how it was directed, particularly at First Nations people, is not clear. So hence, I'm working with the work from the US because it centers race. And there's a group there called the Disinfo Defense League that has a definition of online racialized disinformation, which is fantastic to see. And they define it as false or intentionally misleading communication, which is, I guess, the distinction between mis and dis, or propaganda, which is typically about racial or social justice issues that are strategically created and distributed through online media to deceive or manipulate for the purposes of, again, it could be profit or political gain or sustaining white supremacy. And it includes a series of tactics, again, would be similar to people who've gone through the racial stereotyping literature before social media was a phenomenon. This could be inciting hate, promoting othering, using stereotypes, harassing, slandering, or criminalizing individuals, groups, or movements, and also impersonating and infiltrating groups online to disrupt building of solidarity. So I recommend looking at this particular movement online if you're interested in the topic and its relationship with race. Because of my history and interest in race and social justice, but also more broadly because of what's happening since, I guess, Trump's election and also since the referendum result here, I think some of us are recognizing that there are research gaps in how mis and disinformation is being researched, and also the role of algorithms in spreading mis and disinformation. In the Australian context, there's a lot of work on regulation of mis and dis, and I guess, again, it needs to happen. There's a bit of work on media literacy to counter mis and dis. But even in places like the US and the European Union, where more research and more policy development has happened in these areas, it has been recognized that there is, generally speaking, a lack of focus on the impact that this misinformation has on groups like people of color, women, LGBTIQIA+ communities, and other voices that are less prominent in mainstream political discourse in the US. So that's the point that I want to make about where I think mis and disinformation could do, research could do more work in the future. But there is a lot of research potential because, as I said, current approaches emphasize regulation and media literacy. While these approaches are important, I think what we've seen in the last few months, but also more broadly since fact-checking became more prominent, is that some of these approaches, while they try to emphasize correct information, emphasize source checking and fact checking, they neglect the kind of historical trajectories in terms of how marginalized communities have been shown and that racist tropes have been in existence for a long time. So again, going back to the Trump-Harris debate, the moderator said, we haven't reported any instances of people, Haitian immigrants eating pets in this town in Ohio. But there's another kind of broader historical fact check would have been that actually immigrants of certain backgrounds have been stereotyped by suggesting that they're eating pets. So, that would be, I think, adding to that kind of narrative of what's missing from the mis and disinformation approaches, including in fact checking. In fact, I remember an episode of Neighbors, because I'm finishing that book on television, is an episode of Neighbors where I think they finally decided to introduce an Asian family about 30 odd years ago, and then also got rid of it because they were eating pets. So there is a long history. I also want to highlight the role of independent media in this kind of ecosystem, including independent media, which is owned or operated by people of color. And the fact that in many ways they can help counter this algorithmic spread in the targeted communities. So moving on to the case studies. I've got two here, and they're really all fantastic organizations. I'm just going to find my notes about them. So The first one is called Ultraviolet. The guiding principles that it lists on the official website are disinformation and bias can inspire both online and offline attacks intended to delegitimize and dehumanize women and people of color, and ultimately dissuade them from participating in politics. Women of color, LGBTQ people, Indigenous people, people with disabilities, and people who belong to religious minorities are at an even greater risk of becoming targets of disinformation campaigns, hate speech, and real-world violence. The media must do everything in its power to ensure that racism, sexism, and disinformation do not derail the historic nomination of the first Black woman to the Supreme Court. So one of their campaigns was centered on making sure that this historical nomination went through. So they were quite proactive in trying to prevent disinformation around it. And therefore, they created a guide, and you can see that screenshot on the right, called Reporting in an Era of Disinformation, Fairness Media Guide. This is for mainstream media, for covering women and people of color without bias. We have something similar in development in Australia by Media Diversity Australia. They are working on a race reporting toolkit, but it is very much focused on reporting correctly. And as far as I know, it's not addressing disinformation yet, but we could have something in the next year or so. I did want to show the leadership team and their bios. I think it's interesting that it's obviously coming from people that have got a background in policy and a background in doing a lot of social organizing work. And in the case of the second one, Neeta Chaudhary, someone who's also a child of migrants and has worked on a number of kind of refugee and climate change issues, including on the Democratic National Committee. So this is a screenshot from one of the toolkits that they created. And again, so they're debunking, they are doing a sort of I guess an aspect of fact checking is obviously debunking and saying that something is factually incorrect, but they're also specifically targeting racist tropes, which I think is an interesting strategy, and perhaps something that could be looked into further in all the attempts that various governments and media organizations around the world are looking at to make sure that they're not amplifying the mis and disinformation agenda that's sometimes originating in social media. So one of the examples they've got here is one of the tropes that should be questioned and debunked is questioning someone's origins, heritage, and loyalty. This has happened in very obvious ways since Trump entered politics, but has also happened to small degrees here in the Australian political context. So I should also add that this particular section of the toolkit was developed in alliance with Muslim advocates. So they're very much trying to work with the communities on debunking particular kinds of racial stereotypes. So the key features of their toolkit and their strategies and some of their targeted campaigns, they make sure that there is a degree of pre-bunking, I guess, not just debunking, but pre-bunking to make sure that a historic nomination goes through. There is a recognition that algorithms are biased, and that is what helps mis and disinformation to spread. So algorithms are not neutral, obviously. They're recognizing that the mainstream media is playing a role in spreading disinformation, even when they're trying to debunk it. Sometimes it's having the opposite effect. They're focused on a toolkit for mainstream media, as I already mentioned. And the origins of all of this is in social movement organizing. The second case study, and this is my final one, is of another organization called Color of Change. This is the US's largest online racial justice organization. This is not just racial justice in general, but it's specifically focused on online racial justice. And it has about 7 million grassroots members, which is huge by Australian standards. They have a series of strategies, and one of them is to use research to lobby decision makers, which could be in corporates, because obviously that's where Silicon Valley is, but also lobby decision makers in government. And again, similar to Ultraviolet, they've got a series of campaigns to create a more human and less hostile world, and most of them center on Black people in America. I found this representation of what they do, this little diagram, really interesting, because they're kind of envisaging racial justice as something that integrates economic justice, criminal justice, media justice, and power and voice. I find the use of kind of media justice in the mix really interesting, and something I guess and we could definitely explore further here as well. And I think their focus is again on design justice and designing strategies that change the rules in the industries that affect Black people's lives and have and advance the cause of racial justice by making sure that all of these areas are covered in different campaigns. The other aspect that I wanted to highlight about Color of Change and the Disinfo Defense League is, one is obviously that they're organized social movements, but the other one is that there is a strategy. There's a narrative strategy. So again, that is in some ways more effective than just doing fact checking, is using narrative to make sure that certain long-standing ideas about marginalized communities are somewhat corrected. So again, this is taken from their website. It says, building narrative power is critical in the fight against online racialized disinformation. As opposition targets communities of color with harmful media manipulation campaigns, we all need to be prepared to shift the conversation and the momentum for change in our favor. DDL's expert partners with communicators and organizers to tap into compelling narratives, and they make really excellent use of popular culture, of art, of narratives, memes, viral videos created by the community themselves to try and level the media playing field. So in some ways, again, this is not new to have self-representation by communities and to try to change the mainstream media narratives, but it just has this extra importance, I guess, in the era of viral myth and disinformation about these communities that impacts these communities greatly. And I think I'll end there. I have a lot to say about the Australian context as well, but I want to have plenty of time for questions, so if that's okay.
Yeah. Right. So we might just take it to the audience and see if there's some questions anybody would like to ask. I think there were none in the slide at the moment. Yeah. Any questions?
I'm always down for a question. I wonder about the extent to which, when you're looking through, when you're seeing the impacts and the ways these pieces of disinformation roll out, I think part of the discussion of where fact checking has not been as successful is that people taking in the disinformation aren't taking in information at all.
Mm-hmm.
They're taking up some kind of an ideological construction,
Mm-hmm.
right? So they're not sort of saying pets are in danger from Haitian migrants. They're sort of saying I'm justified in feeling my way,
Mm-hmm.
rather than the pet thing itself. I mean, the pet thing itself is a bit silly because, for instance, the geese comes up, right? The geese, but it's not like Donald Trump comes out and says, "Oh, people are eating foie gras," which clearly people eat geese. It's not a weird thing, and it's not an endangered species in Ohio. But the information just becomes part of this identity construction.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder if you've seen anything that sort of talks about how to unwind that aspect to it, to where you can't necessarily argue against somebody who's not selling truth in the first place.
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. If I had the answer to that question, I would be, I guess, on one of the sort of strategy groups that come up with how to counter these problems. But I think there is a growing body of scholarship, I have to say. It's still small because I think to a large extent in the EU and to some extent in the US and to a larger extent in Australia, because we are grappling with the fast spread of myth and dis, and now with AI, there's going to be even greater problems in how things like deepfake or images and videos are circulated. That I think, and also because of because of this disciplinary formations, because of the way journalism has been thought of in most Western countries, and I guess there's some differences in the global South, journalism has been the place of objectivity and truth and fact checking. And there is obviously some scholarship that says, objectivity is a problem. So I think because of the disciplinary formations, because of the fact that we are so far behind in trying to play catch up in a legal sense, and this emphasis on kind of a truth or an objective truth, the idea of false balance that has also existed in journalism for a long time, and it's kind of reproduced, even if you're talking about something like climate change, whether it's a 99% consensus that it's happening because of, human-induced activities. I think the idea of what is expertise, perhaps, is not clear to most people, especially to people who haven't had critical thinking or media literacy through their education. So I think it's a great question, but I think the solution to that is probably that it has to happen on many levels. A lot of people I think media literacy is important. So a lot of people are trying to do that in curriculum in universities. I was hearing a debate the other day about someone who had written on Hindu nationalism and media in the diaspora, that most international students from South Asia who study humanities and social sciences are not part of those Hindu nationalist groups, but people who study other disciplines are. And I think that's not a problem that's confined to international students from South Asia. So there's obviously various factors that make certain people more vulnerable or makes them less informed than other people. So I think it has to be a multi-pronged approach. But I guess what I am trying to emphasize is that we need to look beyond fact-checking, and we need to look more critically at mainstream media as well.
Question.
Thank you. Thanks for that talk. I'm really sorry I missed the beginning of it, so I hope you haven't covered this already. But you said as you were concluding that you had quite a lot to say about the Australian context. And so I was just going to invite you to use some of this time to say something about the Australian context, if you'd like to.
Thank you, Leah. Thank you for coming here. I think I said a little bit in the sense that I've been trying to look for what's happening here. And I think there's more research potential than there is actual research. There's the Islamophobia register, which I guess takes the wider public's complaints on instances of Islamophobia. There is a little bit of work that the Australian Human Rights Commission has done, and they're doing more focused work on mis and disinformation that I know of. So it's forthcoming. There is a lot of work that comes out of QUT, which again is mis and disinformation more broadly. And I think there's an article in The Conversation by Associate Professor Tim Graham, who was looking at data from The Voice, primarily in social media. And I think his conclusion was that there was a lot of propaganda. But again, it doesn't single out whether there is the ideological stuff that you talked about, whether there is sort of ideological constructs of indigeneity in the Australian population, where there's a kind of settler anxiety that is at play. So I think we are beginning to do that work. That these were from looking at the big data and saying these were the main terms, and these indicate propaganda, including in the mainstream media publications and TV and other kinds of streaming channels. But we're not doing the ideological work yet. So that's the point I want to make about Australia.
Thank you. Thanks, Sukhmani. Yeah, I think it's just carrying on from the last question. Like, I'm wondering why there's not as many of those grassroots organizations doing the work, like the Disinformation Defense League, I think was in the US. I mean, yeah, we've got the Islamophobia register and maybe some others that look at hate speech that are that kind of grassroots level. But I'm wondering if there's a disconnect between civil society and government policy making, which makes that like maybe, or I don't know, maybe you can let me know if in the US the disinformation civil society groups, do they have an ear of government, or is there any opportunity for them to use data that they're collecting to influence policy? And I'm wondering if we have a landscape where maybe some of those steps are missing. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a great question, Amelia. So there are a number of kind of racial justice civil society groups in Australia that have had varying histories and varying levels of success. The ones that I know of are Democracy in Colour, that recently had a change in president, so I don't know what their forthcoming campaigns are going to be, but that's existed for a while. Get Up used to have a separate arm of called Color Code, which I think just exists as an archive online now. So I don't know what they're doing currently. There are several others. I think Australian Youth Climate Coalition has a People of Color network. There's obviously many, many more in the LGBTIQ space, and a lot of kind of sovereignty and self-determination stuff in the First Nations space. To my knowledge, a lot of that, these campaigns, at least places like Colour Code and Democracy in Colour, have, when the government has in the past has had, bills or reforms come up where they're talking about changes to immigration laws or targeting particular minorities, they have sort of done stuff, they have campaigned, they have lobbied. But to my knowledge, there is nothing focused on mis and dis that I know of. And maybe it's coming, maybe it's in the works and I'm just not aware of it. But there is definitely a missing link, I reckon, between having the governments here, having those, a lot of work is happening in the social movement and organizing space, but I'm not sure if that translation to policy or that having the ear of policymakers is happening yet. In the US, I guess it's been a longer history of doing that work of racial justice, much, much longer history. And there's also, like the Squad, there's people like AOC and Ilhan Omar who are in the Democratic Party and who, I guess, have a tendency to represent these interests, whereas in Australia, there's like a bit of a piecemeal history. The Greens often do, but the Greens are not often taken, depending on who is in power, there is not always that link made to policy making in the way that it is happens in the US. So there's a few missing links, but I do think I'm not casting it as a place of deficit, and I'm sort of trying to show that there is potential to do more and potential to make those links, I guess.
There's a question on the Slido. There you go.
Is this from the room or maybe is it from Zoom? If it's from Zoom, maybe I don't know if you understand the question, but the inter-minority landscape, how is the inter-minority landscape like in Australia?
I think I want to hear more about whether inter-minority landscape is just, as in a sociological sense or in an online sense. Yeah, so it's kind of difficult to.
So if you're in the room or if you're in Zoom, you can speak, you can unmute yourself and kind of clarify what you.
Brangman has the chat, so maybe if you can just add on Zoom if that's you there. If not, maybe we just to the audience one more time.
Sure.
And maybe that person can cook a bit more on that, on the question there. Any other questions from the audience here?
I do have a question because kind of piggybacking on what Amelia was saying, and I forgot, don't get your name. Lena was saying, I was thinking this kind of tensions that seems you get with governmentality and then different grassroots. If you find, especially in the online space, you found other kind of interventions or other forms of resistance that are not typified as political that might belong to the realm of popular culture of what Crystal was saying, the sort of the TikTok, the call out TikTok, and if maybe in that landscape, the identities, the political identities, the resistance might be a little bit more nuanced, and in that way, perhaps a little bit more invisible, but maybe they can get more traction because of that.
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, I am becoming more interested in that, and I want to go and look at that racial justice makeup tutorial. I know it's not online anymore, but I at least want to look at the commentary on it. I think the reason I was interested in food many years ago is because I was noticing that a lot of kind of critical multiculturalism work and racial justice work in Australia was happening through food cultures. And so I really value what, popular culture and public discourse can do, that something that's labeled as political, especially in a country like Australia where we barely talk about race. So I doubt that, racial justice is ever going to be a buzzword. So I think you're right, that definitely there's probably a lot of that happening on certain platforms. And so I'm motivated to tap into them and see how they're kind of debunking certain ideas. But I think it could also happen. I think it could also happen more formally, because a lot of these toolkits and reporting kits that are being created, I don't think there is any harm in having similar strategies in Australia. Knowing that we're going to go into especially political events, which are going to be more subject to mis and disinformation as well.
Thanks for that presentation. There were two kinds of initiatives that became prominent that are both aimed at ameliorating injustices in the digital space. They were media literacy and design justice initiatives. So I just want to know, in Australia, are efforts to incorporate and enhance media literacy more common and prominent than design justice initiatives? And which one of them are easier to incorporate?
I don't think that either is particularly easy, but I have seen just in my own kind of orbits, both in terms of, what's happening in the education space and also happening in the research space. I have seen much more work happening on media literacy in Australia, and media literacy that is also trying to counter, information disorder. Is it Tanya Notley at Western Sydney University and other colleagues from the News and Media Research Centre at University of Canberra? They've had several projects that are focused on media literacy. Some of them are in collaboration with the National Media Literacy Association, I think is the NMLA is the acronym. So they've been quite focused on all Australian adults, and some of that work from the NMRC is also focused on Australian schools, and changing curriculum there. But a lot of it is focused on Australian adults and trying to understand how, based on things like class and educational background and regional or urban area, people's media savviness is different and how it can be developed further. To my knowledge, again, there isn't really an ethnicity or race focus there. And I've done a little bit of work, kind of exploratory work with Fan Yang, who's at Melbourne Law School, to look at media literacy and political engagement in South Asian and Chinese communities in Australia. So we are beginning to do that work to understand what is the media literacy that's specific to these communities, because we are finding that there are definitely differences from the mainstream Australian community. And as far as design justice is concerned, I think my university has a data justice research group. It's good to find out about the research and technology research group here. But to me, it does feel like a lot of the work on technology in Australia doesn't have as much design justice as it could. I think we're still very much trying to focus on, have a tech-centered approach to kind of understanding new technologies, and instead of like a social-centered approach to understanding new technologies. I mean, of course, Crystal's work is an aberration from that norm, but I do think that there could be more of that, and there isn't enough of that.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Maybe we just let people think for one more moment. I had one. You mentioned and again, thank you for an amazing talk. You mentioned the European Union. And so I was wondering, looking to them for, what's happening in that context. Maybe could you comment a bit more on what you were bringing up about the literacy aspect then? Because I'm really interested in the Islamophobic element.
Yeah.
Where do you see that going at the moment?
Islamophobia and the European Union, big topic. I will highlight one thing. I mean, what I'm trying to say is that the European Union has been putting in resources into mis and disinformation at the government and the policy level for much longer than we have. It's been happening for at least 5 years that I know of. But on the media literacy issue, I was in Finland last year, and I found out that Finland starts media literacy in early education, I think because they're a neighboring country to Russia. So they're very kind of proactive about the fact that they don't want to become, vulnerable to all the kind of bots and trolls and other kinds of issues coming out of that country. That I think they have a very proactive approach to it, and the media literacy is a pretty multidimensional media literacy, but it starts quite early, which I thought was an interesting approach. So I'll just kind of highlight that example.
Thanks so much. Any other questions? Oh, there we go.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. I'm interested in, you've mentioned toolkits a couple of times. I'm interested to know what they are, like what's included in this toolkit or toolkits.
Thank you. That's a really interesting question and an important question, I think. And if I think next time, if I get a chance to speak on this topic, I will probably focus most of it on the toolkit because I think it's an important and interesting strategy. So in this particular toolkit that I think was created by the Disinfo Defense League, and they also collaborate with other organizations that focus on this issue, they've basically created a bit of a template for mainstream media to report on racial justice issues. And specially target. So it's not just a case of, this is how you report correctly on this community based on the consultation we did with this community. There is also a degree of intersectionality there that's important. And the second aspect that's important is that they've done a lot of research into how these communities are portrayed, not just online, but also in the kind of work in the kind of mis and disinformation that spreads, especially on the private messaging platforms, which are very, very prolific in a number of migrant communities. So I think on the basis of that research, they've come up with ideas about how, how obviously mainstream media can pre-bunk and debunk a lot of the racist tropes that I was talking about, but also how communities of color can be more proactive in reporting them and having mechanisms within the communities to, talk back to the mainstream media organizations and have organizing strategies around not just individuals reporting them to like the equivalent of a body like ACMA, but having collectives that do that.